everyone again, and welcome to our latest podcast, which today is going to be about moving abroad for work and retirement. And I'm delighted today to say that Urs will be joining us, who's actually going through this experience himself. So he'll be able to sort of highlight to us during this call some of the issues that he's faced as he looks to relocate from Europe actually to the Philippines in Asia. And Urs brings with him an amazing wealth of experience as basically an independent financial coach and wealth management. He has a lot of practice in this field, including managing digital assets as well. And Lance is also an expert in crypto as well, which is something that we've touched on in other podcasts that we've done, and obviously very relevant at this moment in time. So including Urs's experience, he's worked with Credit Suisse and UBS, and that role has led him to travel all around the world to meet businesses and individuals with regard to helping them with their wealth management. So I'm delighted to welcome Urs to our podcast. So welcome, Urs. How are you doing today?
Thank you, James. Great to be on this podcast. Always interesting to listen different aspects of expats and financial matters. Yeah, I'm good today. It's a nice weather outside. It's already springtime here in Switzerland, it seems. The winter is not really coming back anymore.
Excellent. Well, look, perhaps we can kick this off by you sharing your thoughts on the changes that have occurred over the last 20 years with regard to expats and financial planning, in particular, the sort of issues that people face when they decide to live, work and retire abroad. So perhaps you can share some of your thoughts on this topic for us.
Yes, sure. I mean, look, I'm looking back like 35 years experience, and early days when I was young, you still had this classic expat life where everyone who actually was allowed to move out to another location, let's say in banking to New York, London, or Asia, got almost luxury packages to live abroad and get expenses covered with lump sum packages, etc. Obviously, that changed in the last 30 years quite dramatically. First of all, many international firms cut back their expat packages. When I was in London 13 years ago, from 2010 to 12, it was only a handful of Swiss coming from the headquarters to be in London on a long-term assignments, as we call it, typically 2 or 3 years. All the others were just traveling in and out, only had short-term assignments. And then, of course, with the arrival of, first of all, the whole globalization changed a lot. And the last 10, 15 years, suddenly we see all these digital nomads going around because everyone can work with a laptop, smartphone, having access to 4G, 5G or satellite internet now, where just put up a Starlink dish on your roof or even take it with you if you want that. It's much easier now to work from abroad. Everything is digital. I'm not talking about traditional jobs, of course, where you have people on factory floors, etc. So you still need to be on site. But what we now see in the recent years is the shifting geopolitical environment, which again has impacts on digital nomads. And I'm not talking digital nomads, which most of us in our age think about, the youngsters who just are sometimes a little bit naive or maybe careless, traveling from one country to the other. And but I also think about the veteran stage digital nomads, which also need to now make more considerations. Where do they want to put their foot on the ground? And that means you need to look at not just where you have a simple life, but also visa requirements. How can you live? Who are you living with? What's your long-term plan? And so there are challenges also with financial regulation, cross-border regulation, which make it often complicated. I'm of course a bit biased with Switzerland, but cross-border regulations are very stringent now. So it's challenging. And there are a lot of things which you have to look at when you change residence. This might be complicated even more for ultra high net worth individuals, but then you have also the resources at hand you can help you to do it. But when you look at more affluent people, maybe with I don't know, 1 million or 2 available liquid assets, you have to be very considerate, what you're doing and how you protect your assets, and how you can also set up this in a way that it is tax efficient, etc. And you're not falling in between in between the regulations of two countries. So this is definitely something which I felt myself in the last few months. It takes time, but with the experience of people like you, James, and hopefully my experience will also help, which I often share in my LinkedIn posts.
Thanks for that, Urs, and I agree with you. I mean, as you say, in the last 2 or 3 decades, when I used to do a lot of work in the Middle East, it didn't matter if you were ultra high net worth or just reasonably affluent. Generally, your company would look after all your needs, including visas, medical insurance, life insurance, often accommodation, air tickets, and all that kind of stuff. And I think that's definitely changed now. Companies very much put the onus on the individual. And I often find that people will assume that they're working in Singapore or the Middle East, and they'll assume that their company provides them these basic necessities like life and medical insurance, and even pension as well. But often nowadays, I think this is rarely the case, and obviously it shows the importance for people of understanding the benefits that they get when they move abroad, and then they may move to another company as well. And I think, as you and I know, a lot of the companies are cutting down on benefits now. They just want to pay a salary and let the employee then make their own personal decisions. And I think this is where, for that person to chat with a coach or a financial advisor is really helpful, because most people lead such busy lives that this probably isn't something that features very prominently for them when they move abroad. But clearly you're demonstrating that really these things need to be taken into consideration. And I think for people like you, when you move from somewhere like Switzerland to the Philippines, it's not always easy to get the right advice. There's a lot of advice out there, whether you be moving to the Philippines or Indonesia or Vietnam, but you really need someone who's on the ground in the jurisdiction where you're moving to, and also understands your background, so they have a more holistic approach to what you're really looking for. Because, as you know, things can change, and it's important to build some flexibility, into your plans, as it were, going forward. But in terms of, as you said, as people move around, and you and I are proof, as many are, that people will move abroad and ultimately retire abroad because of what's happening in Europe, the UK, and the West. Do you think the major financial players like the banks and the insurance companies are able to cater to this market? Do you think they understand the complications of people who move abroad, especially maybe if they have mixed marriages or they come from different religions? How do you feel about this?
I mean, you mentioned so many aspects, James. I think the logical answer is maybe, but most probably not for the majority of their customers. There's several reasons for it. First of all, regulations. They're always looking at their jurisdiction where they're based. So they need to always look at the cross-border regulations. I'm excluding the ultra-wealthy side of things, where there are dedicated teams and tons of experts. But in general, you only have a very few banks who actually support expatriates, whether they are professionals working for a large company or whether they are more the freelance contractors which have maybe gig work or even long-term mandates. It doesn't really matter. You only have a handful of banks, if at all, which can actually support that just from a bank account point of view. But in general, I think it's because of these dynamic landscapes and the geoeconomics playing into it, it became very complex. And then also consider what you mentioned, the cultural aspects. You have multicultural families now, some of them might even have grown up in different countries. It makes it very difficult for a banker to actually put his feet into the shoes of a customer. I think it became more complex, and you need an independent coach or mentor. You can do it yourself, possibly, but it needs a lot of different viewpoints and capabilities to look at. And so I think it's again very crucial to have an independent person who looks at your situation, and maybe just asking the right questions will already help to direct you into the direction you want to go. So I think financial institutions also, when it comes to cross-border regulations, especially in Switzerland, they cut back on the coverage of countries. I'm talking now more about the wealth managers, not about retail banking, but even there, I see the changes going on. And this opens the door for independent service providers and advisors, like Australasia, for instance.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point. I mean, as you say, we've chatted before about the game of life, and sometimes we have to help people understand that often life is a game. So, for instance, if we take someone like yourself who's potentially thinking to go and move to Asia and maybe retire there, and you might go into your bank in Switzerland or the UK and say, "Hi guys, I'm moving now. I'm going to go abroad to the Philippines or wherever it might be." Their natural reaction would be to close. They would say, well, Urs, you should close your account and open an account in another country. However, you and I know that that would probably not be good advice. And that's why they need to talk to someone who can understand the situation from both sides, because we all know that, while, you or many people might go and live in another country and be very happy for 2 or 3 or 4 years, there's always the possibility that you might return to your country of origin or go somewhere else. So understanding what assets you need to keep in your home country and what assets you need to get rid of is really important. And I'll often come across clients who've been abroad for 5 or 10 years and don't have an account in their home country. And as such, it can create big problems for them. So let's say, they reach retirement age and their pension company is now trying to get hold of them and it wants to pay money into their account. But they don't have an account anymore in that home country because they closed it. As you and I know, banks and pension and insurance companies aren't that interested in paying money abroad. And if they do, it's probably going to cost you a lot of money to set up and involve lots of solicitors and legal documents. So again, I think for our audience listening in, it's not good advice often to just listen to your bank or pension company where you came from, because as you said, they don't have the expertise or knowledge to help, this nomad population, which is becoming, bigger and bigger, as it were. So, I think, for our audience listening in, it's really important that they don't just take the word of their solicitor, lawyer, or bank manager, because that they may not understand, what the advice that they're giving to the client, and that actually it may not work for them. And I think this is an area that we can go on to, which I come across almost every day. There's barely a day that goes past where I won't meet an expat in, the Middle East or Asia, and they'll say, "Oh, I've got, 2 or 3 pensions from when I worked with, UBS or HSBC or, British Airways or some other company. And, I'm sure my pension is okay, but I don't really know much about it." And the reality is that it won't be okay. It'll probably be sitting in underperforming funds because no one's able to move it or manage it, because that client is now no longer, in a jurisdiction where they're able to give them advice. So I think those in the audience who, maybe have frozen pensions and have moved abroad, if you're thinking that, your pension is in the right funds or whatever, I think we can say with 90% certainty that it probably isn't, because, as you and I have discussed, the world changes rapidly. And the funds that you invested into 10 years ago are probably very unlikely to be the funds that you want to be investing in today. And I think this is another, area that we can help people, consolidate their assets and, bring them all under one roof, but under a roof where, they can work with an advisor and they can see, from day to day how it's doing, as it were. So, what are your thoughts in terms of, Europeans and the pension industry in Europe and the UK, and what people need to consider, like yourself, when you move abroad with regard to, pensions and tax and that kind of thing as well?
Oh yeah, it's a very crucial point. At least in Switzerland, you have some flexibility, so you can take maybe people who know Switzerland. We have a three-pillar system. First pillar is like the government scheme, which is quite fixed and will always pay out a pension, a monthly one, once you retire, and you're allowed to receive it. That can go global too. You can receive it in Switzerland or then with a bank abroad where you live. The second one, which is the one you probably mentioned, because many countries, especially emerging economies, they don't have such a three-pillar system. The second one is basically a typical pension fund. And I mean, with my thinking with a libertarian mindset, I took that out already some years ago. Then I built up a new one, but they always move from one company pension scheme to the other in Switzerland. That might not be the case in other countries. And as you mentioned, obviously in some countries you might be locked up, frozen, but this can be taken out once you move abroad. You can also leave it in a special setup in Switzerland, but typically the people who move abroad, they take it out, especially if they decide to retire early or for good at their regular retirement age. If they work for a global company, which is international, they might have the pension scheme being kept with that company and will be covered continuously from their headquarters where they might come from. So it is still complicated in Switzerland, but it is easier maybe to deal with the situation in Switzerland than elsewhere. But in general, these pension schemes, they're really like from last century. I mean, they're not coping anymore. So I personally think the more flexibility you have, the better. And that means if you can take it out, put it into a setup which you have control over and can continue to contribute for the retirement and or the time when you actually want to take out the pension, get it regularly or get it paid out as a lump sum.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point, and it goes back again to what we were chatting about, in terms of the game of life. It's amazing how many people move abroad and automatically think that even though they're enjoying the sunshine and the new environment that they're in, that they're better off, still paying into their Swiss or UK or US pension, when the reality is that that's very unlikely to be the best option. But because we're programmed mentally, to think that this is what we should do, we don't seem to understand that if our circumstances change and we move country, that those rules that we've lived by all our life are going to change. And that's why we then need to understand whether we have to change the rules and do different things. So I'll normally suggest to people that, while a US or UK or European pension can always be a good backbone for your financial planning, if you move abroad and work in particular, it's important to set up alternative arrangements that will give you more choice, flexibility, and probably investment freedom while you're abroad. And as you've said, we know that governments in the West are struggling with tax bills and burdens. And the reality is that they're probably likely to tax pensions more or extend the retirement age. For those who go and live abroad, that ability to control your own pension money and have the choice as to where you want to invest it and when you want to take it, I think is really important for people. And I think it's something that people really need to, get their heads around. And I think, I mean, one of the next points we can kind of move on to, obviously, Urs, is that we will have a certain percentage of people who will always return to their country where they came from. and then a percentage, who will, move abroad and retire somewhere else, like yourself. So how do you think that affects people, in terms of making financial plans, or when you sit down with them and give them advice, as it were?
Yeah, again, it's there are several aspects. Obviously, traditionally, people, they went abroad, they worked abroad, maybe even decades, but they always had the vision for themselves, for their long-term goals, to go back, to move back to their home country. But obviously, as the situation changes, Europe is changing dramatically. You see that every day, if you may. I mean, sometimes it's better not to look at the headlines every day because you might become depressive in Europe. But that's maybe just on a personal note, one of my reasons why I'm moving out now and not later. On the other hand, again, you need this flexibility, and you need to have options. So having options helps you also to have confidence in whatever you do. You have a plan B, you might have a plan C. I started to look at plan B, C, and D, like 3 other options, because the world is dynamic, it's changing, and you need to be open-minded. So that is, as you said, mentioned before, sometimes difficult for people who have a decades-long corporate career, moving up the ladder, and then suddenly things change and big layoffs happen, and you almost feel like being stranded somewhere abroad and don't have a job back home. And depending on the situation where you come from, you might also say, why should I go back home? It's maybe too costly. You don't feel like you can create value, and you want to stay abroad. So this is something which needs to be considered, and I cannot give a conclusive answer on this.
Okay, fair enough. And I mean, I think obviously, we've touched on the importance for people who do move abroad to review the basic things like banking, insurance, pensions, investments, and all that kind of stuff. But obviously, one of the other things that I know you'll look at, and perhaps sadly a lot of people don't look at, is also the importance of wills and estate planning. So clearly, when you change your jurisdiction of where you're living, it's really important as well. It's perhaps one of the first things that you should look at to make sure that, whatever legal arrangements that you have in place, like wills and estate planning, are going to be robust enough as you move away. So, for instance, if you decide that you want to start buying property in, the UAE or Asia or the Philippines or whatever it might be, or, if you have a spouse of a different nationality, and open accounts and investments in different countries, it's really important that these are reviewed, because obviously once you move away from your country where you're living and you've grown up, clearly the need for wills and estate planning becomes really important. And I think, as you're aware, at Astra, that's one of the things we specialize in, in helping people who have assets in multi jurisdictions, and maybe you might be in a relationship where you both come from a different background or religion. And again, there, if you go and see your local bank or wealth manager in Switzerland, in the UK, it's unlikely they're going to be able to help you with these issues, because they don't really have the experience or the knowledge. This is definitely a specialist area, which I would encourage our audience to reach out to if this is something that concerns them as well. Have you got any thoughts on that, Urs?
No, I could only agree with you. It is important, and as people are moving more for various reasons, there are also people who want to go to Europe, right? I mean, I know that from some emerging economies, people are moving. We all are very familiar with the overseas Filipino workers. They have a different setting, they have a different motivation why they move abroad, and I fully understand them. But then there are people from, let's say, the developed Western world, which want to move to the south, to the east, Southeast Asia, etc., other Asian countries possibly, also Latin America, Central America. And I think that will increase, even though we will see some obstacles coming up because of geopolitical tensions, and let's not forget, unfortunately, many politicians talk about war these times. So we probably need to keep that in mind and not think that everything will be just the sky is blue and everything will work happily along. So we need, again, many options, and being independent and possibly look at offshore solutions is probably not a bad time now to look at. And also think about your goals and where do you want to be in 10, 20 years? What are your life goals? And this is something I can simply not expect from a banker. First of all, they're not educated for that. That's not their profession. That's not their task, not their job role. They're also not allowed to give you advice in many circumstances because of the compliance and regulations they have to adhere to. So you need to look at in your environment. So maybe already a bit of a summary, if you really want to familiarize yourself with your situation, reach out to people, educate yourself. There's so many blogs and vlogs on YouTube, etc., podcasts like this. Talk with people in a similar situation, with your spouse who might come from a different environment. And if you have trusted people, I hope everyone has a handful of good friends, share your personal situation. It's always interesting what kind of points you might not consider because you're very biased in a tunnel, maybe in a very special situation. And then once you made up your mind, reach out to the experts. Look at the situation, make a plan, have it, maybe put it down on paper, visualize it if you can, and then start tackle all these different issues. And over time, it took me a few months, but then suddenly I had clarity where I want to move, how I want to set it up, and also what are the fallback options if something doesn't work out, plan B, C, D. That's the way I tackle all these complicated situations by itself, but also together the complex situation overall.
Yeah, I think you made some very valid points there, and yeah, I think it's important for our audience to understand as well that we're not just covering people who are moving from Europe and the West to Asia and the Middle East. As you're right, there's a strong movement of people from other countries into Europe, the UK, and the US, and we can help them, I think, as much as people moving in the other direction, and clearly, for those moving into Europe, because it is or the UK, because it is a more regulated and controlled environment, you could argue that there's probably more need to do planning than for those who are moving the other way to, places like Singapore, Dubai, and other parts of Asia where, there's still, the freedom to do, that the regulation isn't so intense. So I think that's a really good point. If people are looking to retire and bring their families to, Spain, Portugal, Switzerland, wherever it might be, it's definitely essential, I would say, to chat with a coach or a financial expert that understands the implications from your perspective and, what you need to do with regard to tax and, selling of assets or bringing other assets into Europe to cater for your new lifestyle. So thanks a lot for so raising that. So I think, in terms of, a summary, really appreciate you coming on this podcast. I think the key thing for us to highlight is that, in this changing and volatile, world that we live in, whether you're, an ultra high net worth individual or, even a reasonably affluent individual, as governments clamp down now and need to raise more and more money to pay for the bills that they've, have shot up during COVID and other mismanagement of economies around the world, it becomes more and more important for, those who want to be global nomads and to travel around to understand how this affects them when they move, and to make sure, as you're doing, is that they take the time and discuss this with friends or experts to make sure that they get it right, because otherwise, obviously, it can cost them a lot of, time, money, and heartache as well. So, yeah, thanks a lot for joining the podcast. Are there any sort of final points that you'd like to leave our audience with?
No, it's as I said, reach out to people, talk with them. There are many unknowns which are not stated in some blogs, or which you cannot listen on or read on publicly available data. So it's really important. Take the time, talk with an expert. That doesn't even need to be a time-consuming process, but often, I mean, I learned it myself in all the aspects with insurance, healthcare, pensions, visa requirements, etc. Real estate, again, when you're foreign, you cannot own land, etc. You need to know all these details, but again, just talk with like-minded people in similar situations, and reach out to experts, independent advisors, and financial coaches, which are also specialized on the expat situations.
Excellent. Well, look, once again, thanks a lot for your time, and thank you very much to our audience for listening in. And please feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions. Otherwise, we look forward to the next podcast. So bye for now, and thanks again, Urs, for your time.
Thank you, James. Talk soon again.